God.
My wife is telling me to get the gum out of my mouth. Welcome and thank you all for coming. I'm going to read this, excuse me, just so I don't make a mistake. Last March, the Village Times Herald published my letter in which I invited these Saturday demonstrators from both sides of the street to participate in the public debate. The only thing I knew about them was that they were not apathetic. The debate won't end with war, or it won't win the war. It probably won't change minds, but it is communication. To do this, we knew that we needed a good moderator. We're very fortunate to have Bill Zimmerman agree to do it. Bill was the ABC bureau chief for a few years, and he was with ABC for 10 years. He covered a broad range of subjects, from the selection of a pope to the election of presidents.
Could I stop you 1 minute, please? Why didn't we do the Pledge of Allegiance? Pledge of Allegiance. We have a flag yet?
Sir, you're absolutely right, and my mistake.
Okay, let's do the Pledge of Allegiance.
That's fair enough. Absolutely. And sir,
Follow me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Born and unborn.
Be seated.
if I may.
We didn't say the Star Spangled Banner.
I appreciate it.
Why don't you sing it?
I was not prepared to say this, but I invited these folks to do this, and I'm sponsoring it, and they both agreed that they can only do it with security. We have security here. I really hope, it's the one thing I hope probably more than anything else, that people are just courteous to one another. I know we have disagreements. So if I can finish this about Bill. His datelines came from around the world, from Cape Town, Port Said, Da Nang, Beirut, and Washington, D.C. Bill was CNN's first prime time anchor. He's won assorted awards in journalism, and he was the driving force behind Long Island's own News 12 on Long Island. We're honored to have him moderate this forum, debate on Iraq. And Mr. Zimmerman.
Thank you very much, Bruce. It's an honor to be able to do this. Bruce, through his own efforts, has created this event tonight, from its idea to its fruition. And so it really is something to see and something good to be a part of. So thank you very much for joining us. A couple of pieces of housekeeping. To let you know, there is a restroom. It is out past the front door and on the left. There is only one. We are going to flip a coin now to decide the order of when these people will speak. So, Bill McNulty, if you'll call it heads or tails.
Heads.
Heads it is. Will your team be first or second?
Second.
Second, all right. Let me read the ground rules first, Graham, before we get started, please. The agreed upon debate format is as follows. Each team will make a 20-minute presentation, and we have a timekeeper. Mike Garib, a junior at Comsawag High School, is here as our timekeeper. After the two 20-minute presentations, there will be a 10-minute rebuttal on each side. The remaining time in this 2-hour event will be for questions from the audience, which can be submitted in written form, or we'll have a microphone for you to come up to and ask your questions as well. Please keep the questions on point and refrain from making speeches. As agreed upon, there will be no signs, banners, flags, message T-shirts, etc. allowed at this forum. And so let's get it underway with 20 minutes. First off, I guess, will be Graham. Let me give you the complete rundown. The team on the left are the North Country Patriots. They'll be going first. The team on the right are the North Country Peace Group. They'll be going second. Graham, are you going to be leading off?
Yep, I'll go off.
Graham Kirby is a citizen of the United Kingdom. He arrived in the U.S. in 1983 with a Ph.D. in history from Cambridge University. He has lived in the three villages since 1992. Graham?
Okay, before we start, can you hear me? Okay, good. Just before so I don't trip over, and before the clock starts ticking, could I just thank you for coming, and can I thank Bruce for doing this, we're all greatly indebted to him. It's a very great contribution to the civic life of this community, and I think Bruce will be telling you he has further plans for other debates of interest to us all. I'll leave that to him. If I can just thank my two colleagues for coming here with me. And I'd just like to call you antagonists, which is in a technical sense a word for a fellow debater. Just that I'm under time limits, so I'm using one word instead of two. Okay, I think that's about all. Okay, so why don't we start the clock ticking now. Defending America, the way forward in Iraq. As a serious, responsible country, America had to occupy Iraq and cannot withdraw. America has three vital interests in the Middle East: oil, non-proliferation, and the defeat of jihadism. The world in general, and the developed countries of Europe and Asia in particular, share the American interest in the secure supply of Middle Eastern oil. Like it or not, oil is the lifeblood of the world economy. Just remember the recessions attendant upon the 1970s oil crises. If you want to enjoy the civilization that you now have, then America has to remain in Iraq. Alternative fuels may eventually materialize, but for now, world civilization depends on oil. Note, we are not saying that America invaded Iraq at the request of the oil companies or to expropriate Iraqi oil. Saddam Hussein was a constant threat to Middle Eastern stability. He survived the First Gulf War, and by 2000 was about to escape from the ceasefire that had constrained his adventurism in the 1990s. Sooner or later, he would once again have confronted America. We don't know if Saddam was a cynical psychopath, but this was a man indifferent to life, even by Middle Eastern standards. He took his children to watch his opponents dissolve in acid baths. He enjoyed watching movies of his opponents' torture. He used chemical weapons. Invasion was his foreign policy. He was not a man who backed down. He placed risky bets for very high stakes. Anyone who challenged his judgment had been killed, though there was no one to constrain him, question his rash judgments, or give him anything but optimistic reports. He saw himself as a latter-day Nebuchadnezzar II and Saladin, the empire builders who had occupied Jerusalem. His imperial complex would have led to war throughout the Middle East. With this character, his past actions, and his imperial ambitions, there would be no doubt that once sanctions were ended, he would rebuild his army and recommence his WMD program. He would have first picked off the Gulf Emirates and then moved against Saudi Arabia. He would rightly conclude that if the world ended sanctions and the United States acquiesced, he could safely invade Kuwait again. And if the world acquiesced in this, they would also acquiesce in what other military adventures took his fancy. Military adventures such as these would have promoted preemptive wars by Iran and Israel. A nuclear Iraq would also start a Middle Eastern nuclear arms race, since many Middle Eastern countries depend on oil for arms, financing the most obvious way for one country to cripple another is to destroy their oil fields. The world economy would be hostage to Middle Eastern politics. Not surprisingly, the new Bush administration early thought of removing Hussein by force. Then, on September 11, America blundered into Islamic fundamentalism. After a decade of attacking U.S. troop installations abroad, jihadism took its fight to America itself. The American political class generally, and the Bush administration in particular, now faced a wholly new calculus. There were people determined to kill as many Americans as possible, just because they were Americans, with every reason to think that if Al-Qaeda had been able to procure them, the hijacked planes would have carried weapons of mass destruction. Chemical, biological, and nuclear attacks on America were a very real possibility. Iraq was the most obvious source of these weapons. Saddam had long promoted terrorism and was universally believed to possess weapons of mass destruction. Would he give them to terrorist Islamics? A reasonable answer was yes. It was a possibility. The consequences of the possibility made its actual likelihood irrelevant. No matter how remote the possibility, no administration could risk this given the consequences of a wrong guess. America accordingly occupied Iraq. Of course, no weapons of mass destruction were found. This is irrelevant. Firstly, even if he didn't have them, he would have sought them after sanctions were lifted. Secondly, Hussein was similar to the habitual liar whom nobody can believe, even when he is telling the truth. His refusal to cooperate with the UN inspectors inevitably suggested he was hiding his weapons. By 2002, none could believe he had surrendered them. If they were not found, this only proved they were still hidden. Their actual existence become irrelevant. Finally, for those who believe Bush lied, that he and his Machiavellian cabal of neoconservatives manipulated public opinion, consider this. If they did do this, then wouldn't they have actually planted evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? Bush was as surprised as anyone when no weapons materialized. My friend Jim will now take over.
Jim Soviera was born and raised in Huntington. He has a BA in history from C.W. Post and a master's in education from Queens College.
Hey, Sabrina. Once it occupied Iraq, the coalition had two options: to stay or to leave, perhaps handing Iraq over to the United Nations. In either case, the administering power had to decide if Iraq should be partitioned. Finally, partitioned or not, it had to be decided if Iraq would be democratized or turned over to another strongman. As a matter of fact, the coalition decided to stay, keep the country whole, and turn it into a democracy. What are the alternatives? A UN mandate was infeasible. The history of UN peace interventions is a history of UN fiascos. Just remember Srebrenica. As the oil for food scandals amply demonstrated, UN is riddled with corruption. UN actually did involve itself with Iraqi reconstruction. Unfortunately, the terrorist blew up its headquarters and its chief representative. The UN walked away. To administer Iraq, the UN would need an armed force. However, only America could provide it. UN command over our troops is neither desirable nor possible. Most UN countries are not our friends. Many are our enemies. Even more mean us harm and have nothing but ill will for us. American troops should answer to an American president who answers to the American people. As a strictly practical matter, if the American public is adverse to its army fighting in faraway places, it will be even more adverse to it fighting for an institution of which they are deeply and rightly suspicious. So what could the coalition have done, and what should it do now? Partition was not practical politics. It would mean enormous ethnic cleansing and a refugee crisis. The coalition might have attempted to preempt violent native ethnic cleansing with its own humane cleansing. This was politically impossible. No American administration could survive the sight of the forcible moving of women and children from their homes to barren refugee camps. Just remember India and Yugoslavia. Partition would thoroughly destabilize the Middle East. Should the coalition have imposed a straw man on Iraq? The arguments for a straw man are firstly, that only a dictator could hold Iraq together and make it a counterweight to Iran. Secondly, the Middle East lacks the conditions necessary for democracy. One answer to the realist position is that the accommodation with brutal authoritarians is what gave us Hussein and Khomeini. Would it have worked? We don't know. But we would guess that our fellow debaters and many of the audience would have objected to such a course and would have castigated President Bush for pursuing it. In choosing democracy, Bush chose the moral option. Will democratization fail? All we can say is it hasn't failed yet. Remember, America required 13 years to settle on its Constitution. Regardless of its chance of success, we believe America had a moral obligation to offer Iraq the chance of democracy. If Iraq is democratized, then it will advance the cause of liberty and freedom in the Middle East. Obviously, the attempt to democratize Iraq has been neither smooth or easy. Certainly critical errors were made in the early days of the occupation.
And Matthew Frizzalone has lived in this area for 18 years. He's studying history at Stony Brook University and is considering becoming a teacher. And we have exactly 10 minutes left before the North Country Patriots' first presentation.
Our antagonist will doubtless spend much time describing the deaths, maiming, abuses, corruption, and self-dealing that have happened and attacking President Bush. This is irrelevant. Leave Bush to the historians. Focus on the future. Failure in implementing a policy says nothing about the need for that policy. That an endeavor is unsuccessful does not mean that it should not have been attempted. You do not necessarily abandon an enterprise because it is more difficult, costly, and uncertain of success than expected. If there are problems, you solve them. If one approach fails, then you try another. Our antagonists offer only defeatism and a pitiful washing of hands. We need optimism. We need the determination that won victory in past wars. We need to make a firm commitment to the Iraqi people. Without that, they will not support us. What would have happened in the absence of the war is as important as what actually happened because of it. Much blood has been shed, but even more would have been shed without it. A reinvigorated Hussein would have caused deaths in at least the hundreds of thousands. With nuclear weapons, his victims would be in the millions. On balance, the war has saved far more lives than it lost. Have there been abuses in Iraq? Of course. Once again, we need perspective. The American Army has conducted itself honorably, far better than any other army known to history. For every story related by the defeatists and anti-Americans, there were stories of American soldiers acting with compassion and humanity. The answers to abuses is, as has happened, to investigate them, punish malefactors, and establish policies that prevent abuses in the first place. What of the American blood and treasure that has expended in this war? Again, this must be put in perspective. Compared to past wars, this war has been bloodless. Consider World War II. A single training mission before D-Day cost the lives of 1,500 men, while on Omaha Beach there were 3,000 casualties in one day. 29,000 never returned, while 106,000 were wounded in the 10-week Normandy campaign. Nor were previous wars free of mistakes and intelligence failures. Think of Pearl Harbor. And corruption. What do you expect? Corruption, hypocrisy, and self-dealing are part of life. Why would you expect war to be different from office life or academic politics? Corruption, hypocrisy, and self-dealing have been attendant upon all wars of the past, and they will be attendant upon all future wars. There was profiteering in both world wars. Again, the answer to problems is to find solutions. To disengage from the world because you discover that men are not angels is morally obtuse. The Iraq War requires moral judgment, not the washing of hands.
Graham Kirby once again. We have about 7 minutes left.
Okay, that's good. To wrap up, pacifism is immoral. Pacifists do not have better consciences than the rest of us. They leave the dirty job of dealing with a dirty world to others. They don't want to get their hands dirty. They are like people who partake in a meal but refuse to join in the washing up. There are evil men in the world, men who mean their fellows serious harm. Prussian and German militarism, Nazism, and communism were stopped by the armed men of the Anglo-Saxon democracies. This is the only way jihadism will be stopped. Do conscientious objectors imagine soldiers revel in killing? They are typically traumatized by their dealing of death and destruction, yet they do it for the greater good. Pacifists stand aside while others act responsibly in an imperfect world. Pacifism allows not merely the evil, but the most evil to inherit the earth. Given the death and destruction that would follow withdrawal, it is strange that our antagonists actually demand it. In a letter to the Times Herald, one peace protester argued for withdrawal because of the death and destruction the war was causing. I think everyone would agree that withdrawal would mean enormously more death and destruction. If the peace group believes the war is death and destruction, are they not committed to staying when told that even more death and destruction will follow withdrawal? Finally, America cannot withdraw because Iraq will become a terrorist haven. We're in a war of civilizations. In the last 5 years, there have been 18 major terrorist attacks across the globe. The Iraqi war is central to our fight against Al-Qaeda, which is heavily entrenched in Iraq. The terrorist leaders have constantly emphasized the importance of defeating the coalition. If we don't fight jihadism in Iraq, we will have to fight it elsewhere. The withdrawal from Iraq will only embolden our enemy. Like it or not, American credibility is on the line. Whether we should have ever occupied Iraq is now irrelevant. Our enemies have made Iraq their battlefield, so that is where we must fight. To conclude, we must stay the course, given the stakes involved, the need to defeat the terrorists, and the loss of life and destruction that will be attendant upon withdrawal. The cost in blood and treasure must be met. Even the Democratic presidential candidates have refused to say that all troops would be withdrawn by the end of their term. Let us have done with defeatism, a resolution from self-hatred. America is a great country, surely a shining city on a hill. If there is to be a global hegemon, then let it be a benign America. The world learned the wages of appeasement, pacifism, and irresolution in the 1930s. Let us not have to relearn them. We're in a battle of civilizations, as I said. There can be no meetings of the mind, no lasting truce with Islamic fundamentalism. There are no root causes of Islamic terrorism. Terrorism is rooted in a theology. Irresolution, accommodation, appeasement, retreat, and weakness led to 9/11. Here is bin Laden himself. To quote him, "We have seen in the last decade the decline of the American government and the weaknesses of the American soldier, who is ready to wage cold wars and unprepared to fight long wars. This was proven in Beirut when the Marines fled after 2 explosions. It also proves they can run in less than 24 hours, and this was also repeated in Somalia. After a few blows, the Americans ran in defeat. They forgot about being the world leader and the leader of the New World Order. They left dragging their corpses and their shameful defeat. This is what led bin Laden to think he could attack the American homeland. Finally, let us leave you with these thoughts. However much America might wish to be finished with the Middle East has not finished with America. To quote the Romans, if you want peace, then prepare for war. And just remember, you sleep in your beds because tough and determined men stand ready to use violence to those who mean you harm. Today those men are in Iraq. We owe them our unconditional support. And to our antagonists, we would say, well, what's your alternative? Thank you, we finished. Can I just say one final thing, which I forgot to say at the beginning? We call ourselves the North Country Patriot Group, but we're not a group at all. We just turn up on there on the weekends. We don't know each other's last names. So these views are the views of myself, Jim, and Matt. They're not necessarily those of the people standing on the corner. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now we'll hear from the North Country Peace Group, and it appears that Pam will be leading off. Pam Burris lives in Mount Sinai. She received her BA and MA in sociology. She's an administrator in the physics and astronomy department at Stony Brook University.
Mike, can I have a few minutes to thank you? I really would like to thank everybody for coming out tonight. This is really a nice full room. I particularly would like to thank you, Bruce. I know you've worked long and hard, and you've negotiated with both sides, and I think we all appreciate what you've done. I'd like to thank Jim Lynch for negotiating for our side, who has met with Bruce and with Graham, I think, quite a number of times to put this together. And Bill, it's really wonderful to have you here, your professionalism, and for taking the time to do this. Thank you. I think that we all feel good about being here in this room and being able to talk. I think that having stood on the corner for a number of years, this is a very nice meeting. I'm going to bring this back down a little bit local. The members of the North Country Peace Group have been standing at 25A and Bennetts Road each Saturday, rain, shine, holiday, from the moment that we joined millions around the world who voted with their presence by standing against the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Standing because of the belief that the power of diplomacy would work, because Iraq was not responsible for 9/11, but we know all of these things today. We stand in support of the troops, their well-being and safety that has not been a priority for those who have sent them. We protest this administration that has put troops, these men and these women in uniform, in harm's way. We stand for their rights to get what they need when they come back home, hopefully safe and sound. We stand against the fact that the U.S. military has been outsourced to corporations like Halliburton and Blackwater. We stand against the fact that corporations like this have ravaged the funding appropriated to them without introducing adequate water, electricity, schools, hospitals, and infrastructure after the administration's orders that that be all destroyed. We stand against the fact that the administration designed a government in Iraq that keeps out the people, elected and otherwise, from the decision-making over the business of their nation. We stand against the fact that the administration has closed over 200 Iraqi government-controlled factories, allowing their operation only if they go private, preferably to foreigners, who would pay no taxes or little taxes and would be able to take their profits out of the country. We stand against the vast unemployment created by this administration in Iraq that allowed contractors and corporations to bring cheap foreign labor rather than to integrate the Iraqis in rebuilding their own country. We stand in protest of the hundreds and the thousands of Iraqi civilians that have been killed or dislocated from their homes, that have lost control over their major resource, oil, that their infrastructure stands in worse shape than before the invasion, that their cultural heritage has been looted, that they have not been allowed to be involved in the work of their war-torn country. We stand to uphold the U.S. Constitution, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and the Geneva Conventions, all of which have been compromised. I'd like to return to the first phrase that I used in talking about members of the North Country Peace Group. We came together in 2002 as a collection of people who did not know one another, who had used up their expression of writing letters to officials and visiting their offices, those that we, the people, had elected, and felt a need to do more. We, like other organizations on Long Island who form a coalition, represent all walks of life, religions, backgrounds, as do those who come to stand with us for the first time. We attend churches, schools, work on a variety of jobs, and we are active members of this community. We are doing a simple thing, standing for peace on Saturday morning in the middle-class neighborhood on Long Island. We are not inflated with any idea that it is any more than that, expressing our First Amendment rights. For this simple act, last year, we were awarded the People of the Year in Civics by the 3 village residents and the staff of the Village Times-Herald. If we could do more to fix what we think is wrong, we would. We stand because of our abhorrence at what is being done in our name that undermines the basic values and the freedoms that we believe in and that we believe are being eroded. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. John Robinson is next. And just a few seconds under 15 minutes left.
Before the clock gets hit, I would just like to express some concern about the labeling one group as patriots and our group as anti-war. I do feel that my attempt to understand what's going on and to question the policies of my government and to therefore oppose this war is not an expression of unpatriotism. I think I am a patriot.
I should mention that these labels were agreed to by the leaders of both sides. The names, the titles were agreed to. Part of the negotiations.
My name is John Robinson. I'm a general surgeon, a 26-year 3-village resident, married with 2 children in their 20s. I know all of us here tonight feel fortunate that we live in this country that has afforded us so many opportunities and, very importantly, the right to openly express our views. We all have different perspectives on the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and tonight I will offer you a skeletal outline view of mine on the cost of the war. Costs that I believe will haunt us and the entire global community for decades to come. Of course, costs cannot be assessed in a vacuum, but must be held up against competing gains. In this case, I do not believe a single clear countervailing gain can be cited. Young American military personnel have paid dearly in a war that Donald Rumsfeld said would take 5 days, or 5 weeks, or 5 months, or certainly no longer than that. More than 3,800 have died, and for each we must ask, why? More than 28,000 have suffered grievous physical injuries. 1 of every 10 soldiers evacuated to the Army's largest hospital in Europe is evacuated for psychiatric problems, many of which will be seriously disrupting long term. Meanwhile, as of 2 months before the invasion, veterans' access to care was restricted. And since 2001, federal outlays for veterans' medical care has lagged behind overall national health care spending. And what are the costs to Iraq? The horror of Saddam's murderous regime now pales in comparison with the killing fields that is now what was once Iraq. No one is safe, and the Iraqi death toll is probably close to 1 million. Iraq's infrastructure has been decimated. The UN Special Representative on Torture reports that the severity and use of torture may be more extreme and widespread now than under Saddam. Oxfam has reported that 4 million are food insecure and in need of humanitarian assistance. 4 to 6 million Iraqis, of a population of 26 million, have been internally displaced or have fled the country, making this the, quote, fastest growing refugee crisis in the world, close quote. One can hardly imagine the impact on Iraqi children. A major cost to us is the loss of an open society. Friends recently told me of their admonition to their children to avoid going on the Al Jazeera website out of fear they may wind up on a government watch list. Is this who we are? Under cover of the war, this administration has woven into our society warrantless surveillance, indefinite detention, and torture, state activities we previously equated with totalitarian regimes. We have suffered a major moral loss. Our credibility has been seriously damaged. Immediately following 9/11, the world mourned for us. Now we are hated universally and considered to be the greatest threat to world peace. What leadership role will we play? Let's look at the costs affecting our security. The July 2007 National Intelligence Estimate states that the Iraq War has made the overall terrorism problem worse, echoing what the CIA, British Intelligence Service, and the Army War College predicted pre-invasion. Our presence in Iraq, which has nothing to do with terrorism, fuels terrorist recruitment. The refugee crisis spawned by the war shows Middle East instability. The effective functioning of international counterterrorism networks is shredded by our present actions and going along disregard international law approach. Federal funding for first responders, port security improvements, state and local law enforcement, and state bioterrorism grants have been slashed. We are drowning in the monetary costs of our war, more than $800 billion by year's end, at least $460 million each day. 10 weeks of the war funding would more than pay for 5 years of the children's health care proposal that President Bush recently vetoed. One day would fund the construction of 84 new elementary schools, not included in the hundreds of billions that would be required to fund the disability costs of returning soldiers. This is a war that the administration estimated in December 2002 would cost $50 to $60 million and no federal tax increases. And finally, what of the cost of our infrastructure? The American Society of Civil Engineers has estimated an expenditure of $1.5 trillion is required to bring our infrastructure up to standards. No such funds will be available. Our property taxes will soar just to keep the schools open. And we are losing the will and ability to do the work given the ongoing piecemeal destruction of our government. We read daily of radical privatization and politicalization of all aspects of government. We are witnessing the amputation of the state's ability to perform core functions. It is my heartfelt hope that for the sake of our humanity, our security, the well-being of our soldiers, the health of our infrastructure, and our position in the world, we will close all our bases in Iraq and bring home our troops immediately. I will continue to advocate for that end and the preservation of our civil liberties and openness in government by continuing to stand in protest of the war on Saturday mornings on the corner of 25A and Bennetts Road. Blind and unquestioning faith in our leaders is not patriotism.
Jim DeVar has lived in the Three Village area for 12 years. He has a degree in architectural technology, and you have 9 minutes and 22 seconds left. East Group. Jim?
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome and thank you for turning out. The Constitution imperiled in the loss of civil rights. Besides the fiscal and physical losses in body and soul, there are also intangible rights. Some of these. First off, we are talking about here is the Iraq War and the war on terror in general inflicts upon the style and perceived process of government. The losses of strength and pride and ideals of freedom and justice in the homeland, when the irony of exporting freedom to a foreign land is in sharp contrast to the lip service that Bush and company tout in their actions for staying the course to plant democracy in a foreign country, as we lose it here, being the height of folly. The Bush administration's run-up to the war in 2002 with its insistent deception through lies, fabrication of imagined threats, shameless reliance on the gullibility of a large block of citizenry, has shown that he failed to inform the Congress and forthrightly present the case for invasion, while failing the people through mendacity and running roughshod over the separation of powers, as the Constitution stipulates, the Constitution being the definition of who we are and what we are as a country, as the basis of law and order. The Constitution and its role as the supreme law of the land is a guarantor icon of the roadmap of individual safeguards, has been clumsily extorted for political power gain and contrived package of perceived safety in some areas of the Homeland Security regimen, in exchange for the winnowing of essential rights by lawmakers in Washington in areas of civil rights, due process, freedom of speech, and the assorted and panoply of restrictions in those areas. As President Bush has made clear in his trump card use of the unitary executive theory to thwart parts of legislation that he claims exemption to by discarding portions of new law, these executive orders to discard parts of legislation, garnering his regal sense of entitlement and his designation as unworthy parts of legislation that Congress has formed and legislated and presented as a bill. He has thwarted Congress's intent in over 400 matters, and he has challenged an excise legislation with signing statements at more than 4 times the total number of signing statements by all presidents previous to him. The most controversial flouting by President Bush was when he revoked John McCain's amendment to the military authorization bill of 2006. In it, Senator McCain, a former prisoner of war in Vietnam, had an amendment preventing the use of cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment or punishment of any detainees by our military. In a similar vein, he began his first term as president with an executive order to categorize as secret classified status all presidential papers of his and previous presidents for an extension of 12 further years to the existing total of 20, thereby shielding his father's papers from scrutiny until 2009. Also in the same vein, by executive order and unitary executive principle, as bespoke by Vice President Cheney, he barred any legislative or other review of minutes of his energy policy meeting with oil corporation executives in March of 2001. Torture and its corroding effect on the Constitution has made headline and TV news waves recently. Revelations in Congress and elsewhere further directly implicated the Justice Department under Alberto Gonzales and his role in quasi-legal rationalization that initiated flouting of the Nuremberg Justice Tribunal, Geneva Convention, War Crimes Treaty, and other treaties and pacts that have been signed, ratified, and are incorporated as part of our Constitution. Habeas corpus, which originated with the signing of Magna Carta by King John in 1215, it simply has been revoked in an overall blanket edict by the Bush administration to detainees, enemy combatants, and there's also a provision in the latter, prior to this year, Authorization Act that the President can apply and designate anybody, U.S. citizen or foreigner, as an enemy combatant and deny habeas corpus, which is the right to show me the body, present the evidence, and due process when being arrested and detained. Patriot Act 1 was passed in hasty and unremarkable hearings in 2001. Some of its features. Did you know that an agent of the government can come to your house unannounced and take your computer records, in effect stealing your valuables under the sneak and peek provision of Section 215? How about an agent infiltrating your civic, religious, or even recreational group and using any or all information gained in the covert role of monitoring for conspiracy accusation against you and your friends? The New York City Police did that for over 2 years prior to the Republican convention to peace and activist groups that were all non-threatening. Your library borrowing records along with internet browsing trail may be used against you by agents, since the librarian who complies must remain silent about the request for such information, in another example of violation of the Fourth Amendment's defense against illegal search. The most outlandish flouting of the rule of law is shown starkly by the Bush team's refusal to abide by a functioning and reliable foreign intelligence surveillance court under the FISA Act. Mr. Bush ignored the FISA law and ordered the National Security Agency to intercept phone calls and email between people abroad and people in the U.S. without warrant, as long as the target was not in this country, thereby inflicting invasion of privacy on tens of millions of people, American citizens and otherwise. That's just the start of it. Thank you very much.
Bill McNulty has lived in Setauket for 43 years. He has degrees in social science and economics. He taught school and now runs his own construction business. He's been active in trying to close the School of the Americas for 15 years. And Bill, you've got 3 minutes and 14 seconds.
Well, before the clock starts, could I say something by way of introduction? First of all, I would like to say that being the last speaker is always very dangerous. The last time I was such, people began to walk out. They're not doing that tonight. But as I was preparing to go on, and there was only one person left in the room, I went back to him and I said, well, how come you're still here? And he said, well, I'm the next speaker. So I would like to say in my 3 minutes that I'm going to read. I'm going to try to read very fast. And if you would like to avail yourself of a more drawn-out presentation, please tune in to WSB 90.1 on Thursdays between 12 noon and 2 o'clock, and you can hear 2 hours. I can stretch it for a very long period of time. So, maybe we start the clock, and I'm going to start reading very fast. Tonight we have tried to promote thought and discussion. In addition, some of us have tried to sound an alarm. We also hope to move you to our position, which ultimately has to do with saving the democracy. Let me start with a quote. We are going to push and push and push until some larger force makes us stop. That's none of us talking. That's David Addington, Cheney's chief of staff, who has pushed furiously to impose an imperial presidency on our country. So, the first challenge I lay down to you is go beyond this war. Excuse me, it's not a war, but an invasion and an occupation of a sovereign state that had nothing to do with 9/11. An invasion based on lies and deception, which lies were ever-changing in the search for justification, one in violation of both domestic and international law, to say nothing of the UN Charter. Second, look at what's happened to the democracy. Preemptive war, perpetual war, the Patriot Act, torturous policy, rendition as a means of further torture, the destruction of habeas corpus, domestic spying, warrantless search, wiretapping, surveillance, the distorting of the media, and I could go on with this to a great extent, and so could you. No group can do in 20 minutes what commentators have been talking about and promoting for 6 years, but what can be emphasized is that we need doubting Thomases, dissenters, and heretics. That's what keeps us from becoming a mass of fearful conformists. And yet that is exactly what our leaders want us to be. Hence, if you are not with us, you are one and the same with the terrorists. And it might be good at this time to clarify just what the terrorist is. It's one who carries out acts of terror, which is the manipulation of fear for political purposes. Fear is the easiest and the oldest way to promote single-mindedness. United we stand further promotes this, but we must ask, for what do we stand? Hundreds of years of the experiment have given us an answer, illustrated by the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the 3 branches of government carrying out the system of checks and balances, the freedom that we take for granted, speech, assembly, religion, freedom from illegal search and seizure, trial by jury, and you too can complete this list too. All of these principles are under assault in an atmosphere of fear and hate brought to the surface by 9/11, which, by the way,
must be looked at much more closely and carefully than it has up until now. An atmosphere in which some religious groups have married their theology and their doctrine to the policies of American nationalism, and an atmosphere best exemplified by two close-shaven young men recently pictured outside one of our national political conventions above the caption, quote, "They don't know much, but they know who they hate." All of this has resulted in the acceptance by so many of what I have pointed out to you. So in closing, what else might be beneficial to point out? Realizing nothing is what it appears, that our national policies have more to do with commerce than with democracy. And if you doubt this, then ask yourself, why have we promoted dictatorships, one of Saddam's like, all over the world, only recently realizing that they must at least appear to be democracies? There's nothing of substance to be gained by demonizing your opponent, and so much more to be gained by thoughtful arguments and positions. And there is much more to be said. I wonder if I could simply read something that indicates so clearly. I'll read it during the rebuttal. Thank you so much.
Before we get into the rebuttal portion